Welcome to the Belly Button Window channel and episode 21 part 1 of the Jimi Hendrix story, like you've never heard it before. In this episode, we begin the deep dive into April of 1968, including Jimi's haunting performance following the assassination of Martin Luther King and recording the Electric Ladyland album. Please remember to check the channel's community tab and video information page, where you will find links to related videos, performances, and stunning photographs from the period. The US tour, or at least the first half of it, wound down at the beginning of April. The most notable performance was at the Symphony Hall in Newark, New Jersey, the night after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. April 1968 also saw the group shifting gear with a pivot towards recording what would become the Electric Ladyland album. These sessions, however, differed from the sessions that had made up the group's first two albums, in that there was little concern for schedule and no concern for cost. Hendrix felt that Axis, Boulder's Love, had been rushed and that it was up to him to ensure that this album had no discernible flaws. The problem was, Jimi would also pack the control room with hangers-on and be caught between entertaining them and recording music. Furthermore, Hendrix was looking to use additional musicians, and he wanted more control in the studio. But there would be a price to pay, further estrangement from Noel, and more seriously, a split with Chas Chandler. So they went into the record plant on West 44th, one of New York's most sophisticated studios, and virtually block-booked it for the next 3 months. Jimi established a pattern for the recording of his next album. By day, recording at the record plant; by night, jamming at the Scene, the Café A Go-Go, the Salvation or the Generation clubs. In relation to success and life on the road, Jimi had this to say: "Since I made it to the top, everything has happened so fast. This pop business is so much harder than people think. It's nerve-wracking and mind-bending. The people who dig ditches for a living don't know how lucky they are. We are constantly under pressure, and the workday is often 24 hours. Every show takes its pound of flesh. I can hardly get anything to eat. We're too much on the go. You see, even my skin is suffering from not eating right. One often gets depressed. It's only natural that we need a stimulant sometimes. I need to slow down." And in reference to recording his new material, he said, "You have these songs in your mind. You want to hurry up and get back to the things you were doing in the studio, because that's the way you gear your mind." All the tracks on this album are very personal. They represent us perfectly. It's very different from what we've done before. Monday the 1st of April, Jimi flies to Montreal, and while there goes to see Chubby Checker play. Tuesday the 2nd of April, and the Experience perform at the Arena Paul Sauve, Montreal, Quebec, Canada, where they are supported by All of Us and the Soft Machine. Set list for the show: Killing Floor, Hey Joe, Fire, The Wind Cries Mary, Foxy Lady, I Don't Live Today, Manic Depression, Purple Haze, and Wild Thing. In a recent blog entitled I Jammed with Jimi Hendrix in 1968, George Gardos describes the Montreal concert and the subsequent jam. Our band Energy consisted of Corky Laying, drums and vocals, Gary Shipp, keyboards and lead vocals, Jean-Pierre Lauzon, guitar, and myself, bass and vocals. We had a rehearsal room in the garage in the basement of a building opposite the Côte des Neiges Cemetery. The Jimi Hendrix Experience sold out the Arena Paul Sauve on Tuesday, April 2nd, 1968, the date of his only concert in Montreal. Hendrix played for just 3/4 of an hour, performing Killing Floor, Hey Joe, Fire, The Magnificent, The Wind Cries Mary, Foxy Lady, I Don't Live Today, Manic Depression, Purple Haze, and Wild Thing. The concert is short. Hendrix was top of the bill, and the English group Soft Machine was the opening act. After the show, Corky convinced Jimi Hendrix to come play at the studio after meeting him backstage at the arena. He then got into the limousine with Jimi and Noel Redding to go to the studio. Of course, word had spread among the bands of musicians who were friends with us. It didn't take much for a line to form. Even when the limousine arrived, she had difficulty getting into the garage. That's when Energy played a short set with Jimi in front of them drinking beer. Then he stood up, took the guitar out of its case, pointed at Corky and me and said, "Let's play." He plugged into Jean-Pierre's Fender Showman and started making a bunch of chords that he wanted me to follow. I just nodded and smiled, not remembering any words. That's when he started pulling through all these chord changes. Corky and I were in the race then. The initial jam lasted 45 minutes without interruption. Jimi lit up the place and seemed to be having a great time. Noel Redding was anxious. That's when he took Jean-Pierre's guitar and sat down on the edge of the stage after diving into the same amp as Jimi. which lowered the sound considerably. That's when Jimmy motioned for him to return to his seat. And without missing a single note, we jammed for another hour, jamming like we had never done before. Jimmy never forgot it either. After the band energy broke up, Jimmy invited me to his studio in New York to play bass with him. Wednesday, the 3rd of April. The Jimi Hendrix Experience are featured in an article in the Staten Island Advance. The group was also billed to perform 2 shows at the Civic Dome, Virginia Beach, Virginia. However, various sources suggest that his concert was delayed a day, and in fact took place on Thursday, the 4th of April, the date remembered due to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Noel recalled, "Air travel could get pretty silly. We landed in Virginia Beach one day, only to be told the concert had been delayed for a day. So it was back on a plane to New York for a night of party at Salvation and the Scene Clubs with Roger Daltrey." The set list for the show: Fire, Foxy Lady, Spanish Castle Magic, Purple Haze, I Don't Live Today, Up From the Skies, Manic Depression, and Wild Thing. Blogger Bill Stokely wrote, "The Virginia Beach Dome seated about 1,000 people. I was 16 and got to drive to the show myself. What a show. Jimmy blew the doors off the place. You could walk right up to the stage and take pics. Got one of Jimmy sliding down the neck during Foxy Lady. I remember using a little camera that was my mom's. The negatives were stolen back in high school." While some Hendrix references state the concert took place on the 4th, source seems to be Noel Redding's diary. Further evidence of this includes various audience members who recalled hearing the news about Martin Luther King's assassination spreading during the concert, which would indicate the 4th. There were 2 shows that night. Because of my age, my folks finally capitulated and said I could go to the first show, not the second. I argued with my mother over what to wear to a concert. She said you need to dress up, suit and tie, for a concert. She was unconvinced that this concert would be different and refused to let me leave the house without at least loafers, nice pants and a collared shirt. I smuggled some blue jeans, tennis shoes and a t-shirt into the car and changed my clothes on the way. I went to this concert by myself but cannot remember why. That summer evening, I drove the 6 miles from my house in Kings Grant, subdivision, to the Virginia Beach Dome. When I pulled into the parking lot, I had one of those "we're not in Kansas anymore" reactions, as I quickly saw that my attempt at casual hipness missed in ways that I could have never imagined. Geez, there were lots of strange-looking people in the parking lot. The show was introduced by a local goofy WGH-AM radio host, Gene Loving, who couldn't turn off the AM radio approach. Once I was inside and seated, I actually had an excellent view if I remember correctly. The first band, Heir Apparent, performed a mildly psychedelic set that was pretty cool, but not particularly memorable. Next up, The Soft Machine, featuring 3 musicians, Robert Wyatt, Kevin Ayers, and Michael Ratledge. The bass player left the tour about 1 month before they arrived at Virginia Beach. His name was Andy Summers. Yep, the very same bassist later to be in the Police. As for the set, an extremely intense and loud set ensued, featuring music from the first and second Soft Machine records. At the end of the set, Ratledge pushed his organ off the stage, causing such severe feedback that my ears are still suffering. Gene Loving attempted his AM stage patter over the raging feedback, but quickly gave up. Finally, they shut down the power in the entire building to quiet the feedback, but of course, plunging the whole place into darkness. About 20 minutes later, the Jimi Hendrix Experience took the floor. Though Hendrix performed and did various acrobatic stunts, he left his guitar intact by the end of the first show. I cannot remember any details of the performance other than I came out the other side with a new religion. The general thought was that the destruction of Ratledge's organ was a gift to those expecting destruction from Hendrix. According to friends who attended the second set, Hendrix burned his guitar. As a result of that action, Hendrix became the first of 2 hard rock bands in the 60s to be banned forever from the state of Virginia. The second band was the MC5, who played at a small club in Hampton and incited attendees to riot during their show. April 4th, 1968, marks the unfortunate anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, as the powerful voice of the civil rights movement was tragically murdered despite his potent message for peace and unity. Today, the memory of King serves as an important reminder of civil unrest and the importance of social equality for all. When word spread of King's untimely demise, an impromptu memorial concert was put together at the Generation Club in New York, New York. This is, however, where the story gets complicated, as various accounts are given of the same night. Either on April 7th or April 9th, the lineup for the performance included Jimi Hendrix, Buddy Guy, B.B. King, Al Kooper, Elvin Bishop, and the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. Further accounts have Janis Joplin, Ted Nugent, and Joni Mitchell in the building, but it's really hard to say. If only the iPhone existed in 1968. Friday, the 5th of April, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience perform at the Symphony Hall, Newark, New Jersey. Then later Jimmy jams with Buddy Guy at the Generation Club. The Experience, along with Soft Machine, were booked to perform 2 shows at the Symphony Hall in Newark, New Jersey. The city had been simmering with racial tension for some time, and when news of Martin Luther King's assassination hit the city, the downtown area exploded. Everybody was nervous about doing the gig. They were hanging about at the hotel waiting to see if there would be any concert at all. The word came that it was on. The limo driver was adamant. "Jimmy sits up front with me or I don't go." With the white guys slumped uneasily in the back, the car made its way cautiously to the Symphony Hall. The gear truck was unloaded in silence in a back street behind the theater. Neville gave Hugh the keys to lock up and disappeared through the stage door. Outside the theater, Newark was like a ghost town. Tanks on the street corners, sporadic gunfire in the distance. Even though tickets for both shows were sold out, only 1/5 of the crowd bothered to come. Many fans forfeited their tickets for the safety of their homes. The rioting became so bad that the second show was cancelled for the safety of the audience and musicians. Meanwhile, huddled nervously backstage were Hendrix and 5 anxious Britons eager to return to Manhattan alive. According to one concert attendee, the hall was only half filled at best when the Soft Machine, the opening act, took the stage for their set. It remained that way. Half the people with tickets stayed home. When Jimmy and the Experience came out, Jimmy said, "I've lost a good friend," or something like that, and beckoned everyone to move up towards the front, which we did. I brought along my little Kodak Brownie camera and moved right up to the lip of the stage to take photos of Jimmy during the opening number, Purple Haze. Jimmy played a white Strat. During the course of their set, I snapped away at the band while they ran through tunes like Red House, on which Jimmy played with a Sunburst Fender Jazzmaster guitar, Hey Joe, Manic Depression, Fire, Foxy Lady, The Wind Cries Mary, and finally, I Don't Live Today. It was a short set. Jimmy also played a black Les Paul Custom for one tune. The main thing I remember is that Jimmy stood very still for the entire set and just played. No histrionics, no wild showmanship. He was clearly upset over King's death and did nothing but play great, soulful guitar. At the end of I Don't Live Today, Jimmy raised his white Strat over his head and threw it into his Marshall amps. I remember the white coiled cord being stretched to its limit and then the guitar being thrown. He smiled and walked off. The second show, planned in Newark, was cancelled due to the assassination of Dr. King the day before. A non-violent activist for black civil rights, Martin Luther King played a major role in the emancipation of African Americans and awareness of the injustice of segregation in the United States. I Have a Dream, the title of his speech calling for fraternity between blacks and whites, has become a true anthem for solidarity and the hope of understanding between all communities. According to Mark Boyle, lighting operator with the Soft Machine, who was quoted in the book Electric Gypsy by authors Shapiro and Glebbeek, Hendrix came out to enormous applause and said, "This number is for a friend of mine," and he abandoned completely his normal set. The band played an improvisation which was absolutely hauntingly beautiful. Immediately everyone knew what this was about. This was a lament for Martin Luther King, and within minutes the whole audience was weeping. Old redneck stagehands came on the side of the stage, and they were standing there with tears running down their faces. The music had a kind of appealing beauty, harrowing music. When he came to the end, there was no applause, and the whole audience was sobbing, and he just walked quietly off the stage. Boyle also noted that Jimmy used his Les Paul on Red House and his Jazzmaster on the song Fire. Another audience member recalled, "I saw the Jimi Hendrix Experience at Symphony Hall in Newark, April 5, 1968, the night after Martin Luther King was killed." The National Guard patrolled the streets in preparation for race riots that the city thought might occur as a result of Dr. King's death. Just the previous year, there had been serious rioting in Newark with much destruction, looting and violence that resulted in multiple deaths. I lived in a neighboring town at the time. Our parents were very hesitant to let us go to Newark that night, so my friend's father, rest his soul, bought a ticket, drove us there and sat through the show with his earplugs in. Symphony Hall was perhaps 50% full. People stayed away. The opening act was the Soft Machine, and we enjoyed them. Then, Jimmy and the band came out. Jimmy said something about losing a friend, then asked everyone in the crowd to move up, as there were many empty seats. They played most of Are You Experienced and other tunes, including Fire, Foxy Lady, Hey Joe, Purple Haze, and Red House, and they ended with I Don't Live Today. Jimmy was subdued throughout the concert, as one might expect, but at the end he raised his white Strat over his head and threw it into his Marshall stacks, smiled, and walked off. That was it. No encore. And it was a short set, maybe 30, 40 minutes. Of course, we were blown away. That night, Jimmy played a Strat, a Sunburst Jazzmaster, and a black Les Paul Custom. Here is a further recollection of the time from light show designer Mark Boyle. I was terrified that Jimmy was going to be killed. At the time, everyone thought there was an insane conspiracy to eliminate anyone who was seen as a threat to the extreme right in America and who was next on the list. And we were out in the auditorium with the projectors for the light show, and what would we do if someone suddenly stood up with a gun? Noel talking about race and Jimmy's blackness. Our gig in Newark brought home to me how little I understood about America. We got into the limo and drove from Manhattan, and as soon as we crossed into Newark, we were somewhere weird, a place with tanks in the streets but no people. I didn't know what was going on. At the hall, we were met by police. We freaked. What had we done? Then, we heard that Martin Luther King had been assassinated and Newark was under siege. This was beyond my experience. The cops told us there might be a riot and we should do one show, do it quick and then F off. The hall was huge, a several thousand-seater, but contained at most 200 people. We did the show for the deserving few who had braved the streets and escaped as quickly as possible. This was an occasion when the whole black thing hit Jimmy in the face. He couldn't turn away. Jimmy was never heavy about being a black. He was into being Jimmy. Human being and pop superstar. When his blackness became an issue, he dealt with it but never put it up front. Hendrix author John McDermott adds that, having finally made their escape, Hendrix later turned up at the Generation Club, where Buddy Guy was performing. Filmmaker D.A. Pennebaker was also in attendance, scurrying to the club with all the film equipment he could carry. In capturing Guy's set, Pennebaker's single camera also caught Hendrix himself monitoring Pennebaker's Nagra tape recorder. Ever the recording enthusiast, Hendrix volunteered to act as soundman for Pennebaker, sitting virtually at Guy's feet, before the guitarist summoned him to the stage to play. After Newark, the Experience played one more gig, in White Plains, New York State, before flying to England for a short rest. Neville Chesters, the band's roadie, also took a holiday, but never went back. He'd been with the band since the Monkees tour, and although it had been only 9 months before, in another sense it was a different era. He recalled, "Things weren't actually going that well with the group. By that time, April 1968, I think that was the early days of it. I'm sure Mitch and Noel were getting, hundreds of people were hanging around Jimmy. You could not speak to him, you couldn't get anything together, and everybody was getting angry with each other. So psychologically, I had the feeling that it wasn't going well. We had a good time, we had a great time, and it was due to end for some reason." The band returned to New York about 2 weeks later to begin work on Jimmy's most ambitious project to date, the double album, Electric Ladyland. As we have seen, in interviews with Jimmy at the back end of 1967 and early 1968, he gave clear notice as to how he wanted his recording career to progress. That concludes this installment of the series. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we will continue the deep dive into April of 1968 of the Hendrix story, including the Generation Club jams and the recording of their third album, Electric Ladyland. Don't forget to subscribe for future content updates. And by the way, if you have any stories or anecdotes to contribute, we would love to hear from you. Best wishes, and remember to let your fancy flow.